The evening sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the Last Stop Saloon, painting golden stripes across worn floorboards that had seen decades of boots, brawls, and broken dreams. Behind the bar, Jed Peterson methodically polished a glass with a well-worn rag, his weathered hands moving with the patience of a man who'd learned that most things in life didn't require rushing. The saloon breathed with the quiet rhythm of a typical evening in Millbrook. A few regulars nursed their drinks, while the soft click of poker chips punctuated the stillness from a corner table where Doc Wilson and the blacksmith played their nightly game. The place wasn't much, just another dusty watering hole in another dusty town. But it was Jed's, and he'd spent the last 5 years building it into something respectable. Sarah, the young barmaid, moved between tables with practiced ease, her gentle smile a constant reminder of why folks preferred the Last Stop to the rowdier establishments on the edge of town. "Another coffee, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, already reaching for the pot she kept warm specially for him. Jed nodded, his gray eyes never leaving the entrance. Something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the way the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Or perhaps it was the unusual quiet that had settled over the town since sunset. Either way, his instincts, honed by years he preferred not to discuss, told him change was riding hard toward Millbrook. As if summoned by his thoughts, the hollow sound of hoofbeats echoed down the street, growing louder with each passing moment. The regular patrons tensed almost imperceptibly, years of frontier life having taught them to read the intentions of approaching riders in the rhythm of their horses' gaits. These weren't the steady hoofbeats of ranchers coming in for an evening drink. The saloon's bat-wing doors cast shifting shadows as 5 riders drew up outside. Through the dusty windows, their silhouettes looked like dark giants against the setting sun. The conversations died, cards stopped shuffling, and even Sarah's footsteps fell silent on the wooden floor. Jed continued wiping the same glass, his movements unchanging as the first man pushed through the doors. Dust and trail grime covered his duster, but the gleam of well-oiled revolvers at his hips spoke of careful preparation for things other than cleanliness. 4 more men followed, each carrying the same air of casual menace. The leader's eyes swept the room before settling on Jed with a smirk that had probably started more than a few fights. "Well, well," he drawled, voice carrying the scratch of trail dust and bad intentions. "Looks like we found ourselves a real fancy establishment. Tell me, old-timer, you serve real whiskey here, or just that watered-down piss they call drinks in these backwater towns?" As the Outlaws stepped through the saloon doors, disrupting the quiet evening, the tension in the air becomes unbearable. What will Jed do next? Stick around to uncover the secrets of the Saloonkeeper's past. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Jed will stand up to them? Your thoughts mean the world to us. The leader's mockery hung in the air like gun smoke, but Jed's hands remained steady as he set down the glass he'd been polishing. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, carrying the kind of confidence that comes not from bravado, but from something deeper. "We serve whatever a man's earned the right to drink," Jed replied, his voice carrying the weight of years, yet holding a subtle edge that made Sarah glance at him sharply. She'd never heard that tone from him before. The Outlaws spread out across the saloon with practiced efficiency. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, claimed a spot directly in front of Jed. His companions positioned themselves strategically, 1 by the door, 2 near the poker table, and the last lounging against the far wall, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Name's Wade," the leader announced, though nobody had asked. "These here are my brothers in arms, and we've had ourselves a long, dusty ride." He tossed a coin onto the bar. "Your finest whiskey, old man, and keep it coming." Jed picked up the coin, examined it briefly, then set it back down. "This establishment runs on honest currency, Mr. Wade. Confederate money stopped being good here about 20 years ago." A dangerous silence fell over the saloon. The outlaw closest to the door shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his gun. Wade's eyes narrowed, but his smirk remained fixed in place. Well, ain't you just full of surprises? A comedian running a saloon in the middle of nowhere. He reached into his coat and pulled out a handful of genuine coins, letting them clatter across the bar. That honest enough for you, old-timer? Or do you need to inspect each one? The other outlaws laughed, a harsh sound that made several patrons quietly gather their belongings and head for the door. Doc Wilson and the blacksmith remained at their table, but their cards lay forgotten. Your money's good, Jed said calmly, reaching for a bottle. But in my establishment, we show respect to everyone. Wade leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Respect? You want to talk to me about respect? He swept his arm across the bar, sending glasses crashing to the floor. Where I come from, respect is earned through steel and powder, not serving drinks and wiping tables. Sarah moved to clean up the broken glass, but Jed subtly shook his head. His eyes never left Wade's face. And for a moment, something flickered in their depths, something cold and familiar to anyone who'd ever stared down a gun barrel. Where I come from, Jed replied softly, a man's actions tell you everything you need to know about him. And right now, Mr. Wade, you're telling me quite a lot. The tension in the saloon thickened as Wade's face darkened at Jed's words. He pushed away from the bar slowly, deliberately, like a snake preparing to strike. Boys, he called out, his voice carrying an edge of cruel amusement. I think our friend here needs a lesson in hospitality. The outlaw by the door flipped the sign to closed, while another began overturning tables. The crash of breaking furniture echoed through the room like gunshots, making Sarah flinch. Doc Wilson and the blacksmith rose from their seats, but a warning glare from one of Wade's men kept them rooted in place. You see, Wade continued, pacing the length of the bar, a man in your position ought to be more accommodating. This here's a nice establishment. Be a shame if something happened to it. He picked up a bottle of expensive whiskey, studied it for a moment, then let it slip from his fingers. The sound of shattering glass punctuated his threat. Jed remained motionless behind the bar, but his eyes tracked every movement with an intensity that seemed at odds with his peaceful demeanor. An observant person might have noticed how he kept his right hand slightly lower than his left, or how he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all 5 outlaws. I heard talk in the last town, one of Wade's men called out. A wiry fellow with a patchy beard. Folks said this place was different, said the owner was some kind of… He paused, grinning maliciously. Reformed man. A knowing chuckle rippled through the gang. Wade's smile widened as he leaned back against the bar. Reformed, huh? Well, ain't that interesting? Tell me, old-timer, what exactly needs reforming? Before Jed could respond, the saloon's back door creaked open. Tom Bennett, the town's young deputy, stepped inside, freezing when he saw the scene before him. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun. I wouldn't, Wade warned, without even turning around. The outlaw by the wall had already drawn and aimed at the deputy's chest. Why don't you join our little party instead? Your timing is perfect. Our friend here was about to share his life story. Tom's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment as he raised his hands. One of the outlaws relieved him of his gun and shoved him toward the bar. Now then, Wade said, his attention returning to Jed. Where were we? Ah, yes, your mysterious past. He reached across the bar and grabbed a handful of Jed's shirt, pulling him closer. What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? For the first time that evening, something changed in Jed's expression. It wasn't fear, no, it was something else entirely. Something that made Wade's grip loosen ever so slightly. Son, Jed said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room. You really don't want to know who I used to be? Wade released his grip on Jed's shirt with a mocking laugh, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The kind of uncertainty that comes from recognizing something dangerous too late. He covered it quickly with another smirk, running his fingers along the bar's polished surface. Actually, old-timer, I think we do want to know. He turned to address his men, spreading his arms theatrically. What do you say, boys? Should we hear what kind of man our friend here used to be? From the darkest corner of the saloon, a gravelly voice cut through the tension. "I can tell you exactly who he is." All eyes turned to an old drifter hunched over his whiskey, his face shadowed by a worn cavalry hat. "Saw him once, about 15 years back, down in Dodge City." The drifter took a long drink, seeming oblivious to the dangerous attention he'd drawn. "Fastest draw I ever saw. 3 men called him out. Professional gunmen, mind you. All of them dead before the last one cleared leather." He finally looked up, his weathered face catching the lamplight. "They didn't call him the Widowmaker for nothing." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Wade's men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado cracking slightly around the edges. But Wade himself just laughed, though it sounded forced. "The Widowmaker?" He spat on the floor. "That's just a story mothers tell their children. A ghost story to scare folk into behaving." He turned back to Jed, jabbing a finger at his chest. "This here's just a washed-up old man serving drinks in a backwater town." Jed hadn't moved during the entire exchange, but something in his stance had shifted. It was subtle, the way his weight had settled onto the balls of his feet, how his hands now rested flat on the bar instead of holding a glass. Small details that only a trained eye would notice. "I retired for a reason," Jed said softly, his words carrying the weight of old pain. "Hung up my guns and swore I'd never draw them again, but that doesn't mean I forgot how." Deputy Tom Bennett, still standing with his hands raised, watched the exchange with growing understanding. He'd always wondered about the old saloonkeeper, about the way he moved, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room. Now it all made sense. "Last chance," Jed continued, his voice hardening. "Take your men and ride out. Find another town to terrorize, because if you push this any further—" He left the threat unfinished, but its impact was clear. Wade's face twisted with rage. He drew his gun in one fluid motion, pressing the barrel against Jed's forehead. "Or what, old man? You'll serve me another drink? Face it, your time's long past. The West belongs to men like me now." But even with cold steel pressed against his skin, Jed didn't flinch. Instead, a small, deadly smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that had once made hardened killers think twice. "Son," he said quietly, "you really shouldn't have done that." The lamplight flickered across Wade's gun barrel as it pressed against Jed's forehead, casting dancing shadows across the saloon's weathered walls. The moment stretched like taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest movement. Sarah stood frozen behind the bar, her hands clutching a serving tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "You know what I think?" Wade's voice dripped with contempt as he pulled back his gun just enough to gesture with it. "I think you're all talk. A man who was really the Widowmaker wouldn't be hiding behind a bar, serving drinks to farmers and cowhands. He wouldn't let scum like us walk in here and take over his precious saloon." One of Wade's men, emboldened by his leader's display, grabbed a bottle from behind the bar and took a long drink. "Maybe he's right, boss. Look at him. Can barely stand straight. Probably tells stories about being the Widowmaker just to keep troublemakers away." The others laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Something about Jed's calm demeanor in the face of certain death had them on edge. The old drifter in the corner hadn't moved, but his hand had disappeared beneath his table. "Tell you what," Wade continued, lowering his gun but keeping it ready. "Since you're such a legend, why don't you prove it? Draw that hidden gun I know you've got stashed somewhere and show us all the famous Widowmaker in action." His voice turned mocking. "Oh wait, that's right. You're reformed. Swore off guns forever." Jed's eyes never left Wade's face. A man doesn't need to prove anything to those who won't live long enough to appreciate the lesson. The words hung in the air like smoke. Wade's face contorted with rage. He swung his gun towards Sarah, who let out a small gasp. "Maybe you need some motivation, old man. How about we start with your pretty little barmaid here?" "Mr. Peterson," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes fixed on Jed with complete trust. The change in Jed was immediate but subtle. Only those who knew what to look for would have noticed how his shoulders squared ever so slightly, how his breathing became measured and controlled. The transformation wasn't physical so much as spiritual, like watching a sleeping wolf wake up. "Last warning," Jed said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from having dealt death more times than he cared to count. "Take your hand off that trigger before I make you wish you had." Wade's answer was to cock his hammer. Big words from a man who's about to watch someone die because he's too much of a coward to... The rest of his sentence was cut off by the sound of breaking glass. One of his men had dropped his bottle, but he wasn't looking at the mess. He was staring at something behind the bar, his face pale in the lamplight. In the reflection of the mirror behind Jed, they could all see what had been hidden by the bar. His right hand resting on the grip of an ancient Colt, worn smooth by years of use but clearly well-maintained. The gun of a man who'd hoped never to need it again, but knew better than to be unprepared. The sight of Jed's hand on the Colt changed the atmosphere in the saloon instantly. The air grew thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Wade's men shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. Even the dust motes dancing in the lamplight seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen next. "So," Wade sneered, though his voice had lost some of its confidence, "the old-timer does have teeth after all." He kept his gun trained on Sarah, but his eyes never left Jed's reflection in the mirror. "But can you still use that antique fast enough to save her? Time has a way of slowing a man down." Deputy Tom Bennett watched the scene unfold with growing anxiety. He'd seen his share of standoffs before, but this was different. The calm in Jed's eyes wasn't the forced bravado of a man trying to be brave. It was the serene certainty of someone who'd faced death so many times it had become an old acquaintance. "Mr. Wade," Jed said softly, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "I've killed more men than you've probably met in your entire life. Each time, I saw the same look you've got in your eyes right now. That mixture of fear and pride that makes a man do foolish things." His fingers tensed almost imperceptibly on the Colt's grip. "Don't let pride make you do something stupid." Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes locked on Jed's face. Despite the gun pointed at her head, she showed remarkable composure. Perhaps she'd seen something in Jed's demeanor over the years that had prepared her for this moment. "They say," the old drifter spoke up again from his corner, "that the Widowmaker once faced down 7 men in Santa Fe. Story goes he gave them all the same warning, one chance to walk away." He took another sip of his whiskey. "None of them took it. None of them lived to regret that choice either." Wade's face twisted with rage. "Shut up, old man," he shouted, his composure cracking. "These stories don't mean anything. The West has changed. The day of legends is over." "The West might have changed," Jed agreed calmly, "but some things remain the same. A man's word, his honor. His duty is to protect those who can't protect themselves." His eyes met Wade's in the mirror, and the simple truth that there's always someone faster, someone more dangerous than you think you are. The wiry outlaw by the door suddenly spoke up, his voice quavering. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Wade screamed, his face reddening. "Nobody's leaving. This decrepit old fool is going to learn what happens when you challenge real killers." He pressed his gun harder against Sarah's temple, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Later, those who witnessed what happened next would swear they never saw Jed move. One moment, his hand was resting on the Colt. The next moment exploded into action so fast that most eyes couldn't follow it. Jed's draw was a blur of motion, smooth as silk and quick as lightning. The Colt's report was deafening in the confined space of the saloon, but more shocking was its precision. Wade's gun went flying, a clean shot having struck it perfectly at the cylinder. Before the echo of the first shot had died, Jed had already shifted his aim to cover the remaining outlaws, his movements fluid and economical. Not a single wasted motion. Sarah ducked behind the bar as Wade clutched his stinging hand, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "That was a warning," Jed said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "The next one won't be." Wade backed away from the bar, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and fury. "You're dead, old man. You hear me? Dead. You think this is the end?" He gestured to his men who were already backing toward the door. "We've got friends, lots of friends. By sunrise tomorrow, this whole town will be crawling with riders who'll make you wish you'd never touched that gun." The wiry outlaw had already mounted his horse outside, and the others quickly followed suit. Wade was the last to leave, walking backward with his hands raised but his face twisted in a snarl. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Widowmaker. We'll be back, and next time, there won't be any warnings." The sound of galloping horses faded into the night, leaving the saloon in eerie silence. Jed carefully unlocked his revolver but didn't holster it. He'd seen too much in his life to think this was over. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah said softly, emerging from behind the bar. "What are we going to do?" Deputy Bennett stepped forward, his face grim. "I'll ride for the marshal's office tonight. Maybe we can get some help." "No time," Jed cut him off, his eyes fixed on the door. "Wade's gang runs with the Carson brothers. They've got a camp less than 2 hours' ride from here. They'll be back before dawn with numbers." The old drifter stood up, revealing a cavalry carbine that had been hidden under his table. "Then we better get ready?" He smiled, showing teeth that gleamed in the lamplight. "Name's Bill Hawkins. Rode with you once, outside of Tombstone. Figured it was time to return the favor." Jed studied his old companion for a moment before nodding. "We'll need more than 2 guns." "You'll have them," the blacksmith spoke up, standing from his table. "Every able man in town owes you for keeping this place decent. Just say the word." Jed looked around the saloon, at Sarah's determined face, at Tom's eager stance, at the growing resolve in the eyes of those present. He'd spent 5 years trying to escape his past, trying to build something peaceful. But sometimes, he realized, peace had to be defended with violence. "All right," he said finally, checking his ammunition. "We've got work to do, and not much time to do it." Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Within an hour, the saloon had become a makeshift command center. Men and women from all corners of town gathered, some bringing weapons, others offering supplies or shelter. But not everyone shared the same resolve. "We should just leave," Mayor Harrison's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. "Wade's gang isn't just a bunch of common thugs. They've burned down 3 towns in the territory. We can't stand against that kind of force." Jed stood at the bar, methodically checking and loading revolvers from a wooden chest he'd brought down from his room. Each weapon was old but immaculately maintained, telling its own story of his past. He looked up at the mayor, his eyes hard as flint. "Running won't solve anything," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "They'll just follow. Hunt down anyone who escaped. Make an example of them." He slid a freshly loaded revolver across the bar to Tom Bennett. "Sometimes, the only choice is to stand your ground." Bill Hawkins was organizing volunteers into groups, his military experience showing in the way he assessed each person's capabilities. "We've got 15 men who can shoot," he reported. "Another 10 who can load and support. Not much against what's coming, but it's better than nothing." Sarah moved through the crowd, distributing coffee and ammunition with equal efficiency. She paused by Jed's side, her voice low. "Mr. Peterson, I heard some of the men talking. They say the Carson brothers have more than 50 riders. Maybe the mayor's right." "Numbers aren't everything," Jed replied, but his eyes softened as he looked at her. "Sarah, you should go. Take the women and children. Head for the hills until this is over." She straightened her spine, chin lifting in defiance. "This is my home too. I'm staying." Before Jed could argue, the blacksmith's apprentice burst through the door, his young face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Peterson! Sir! I was watching the South Road like you asked. There's dust on the horizon! Riders coming fast!" The room fell silent. Jed shared a look with Bill, who nodded grimly. "That's not the main force," the old cavalryman said. Scouts, probably, testing our defenses. Or trying to catch us running, Jed agreed. He turned to address the crowd, his quiet voice somehow filling the entire room. Listen to me, all of you. I won't lie. What's coming is dangerous. Maybe the most dangerous thing you've ever faced. If anyone wants to leave, now's the time. No one will think less of you. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved toward the door. Instead, they looked at him with growing determination, as if his words had stiffened their resolve rather than weakening it. Then let's get to work, Jed said, picking up his own Colt. We've got a long night ahead of us and a lot to prepare before dawn. The night passed in a blur of activity. Jed and Bill positioned defenders strategically throughout the town, turning Millbrook's main street into a carefully planned battleground. The saloon, with its commanding view of the approach, became their fortress. Windows were barricaded, leaving only narrow firing slots. Every angle was covered, every escape route secured. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky, Jed stood on the saloon's balcony, scanning the horizon. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, as if the very land was holding its breath. Below him, armed townspeople moved between buildings like shadows, taking their assigned positions. "Riders coming?" Bill called softly from his position at the corner. "Lots of them. Looks like the whole Carson outfit." Jed watched as a cloud of dust approached from the south, growing larger with each passing moment. Through his old field glasses, he could make out at least 40 riders, with Wade and 3 men he recognized as the Carson brothers leading the column. "Remember," Jed called down to the defenders, his voice carrying just far enough, "let them come into town. Don't fire until you hear my shot. Make every bullet count." Sarah appeared at his side, carrying his gun belt. The worn leather had been freshly oiled, the holster positioned for a cross draw. "They're scared," she said quietly, nodding toward the townspeople below. "But they're ready." Jed buckled on the gun belt with practiced ease. "Fear's natural. Courage is choosing to stand anyway." He turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "There's still time for you to—" "Don't!" she cut him off. "I told you, this is my home too." The thunder of hooves grew louder as the gang approached. They entered the town at a gallop, their horses' hooves kicking up dust from the unpaved street. Wade and the Carson brothers reined up in the center of town, their men spreading out behind them in a show of force. "Come on out, old man!" Wade's voice boomed across the empty street. "Face us like the legend you pretend to be." Jed stepped out onto the balcony, fully exposed. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the weathered boards. Below him, the Carson brothers shifted in their saddles, clearly unsettled by his calm demeanor. "Last chance," Jed called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Ride away now, and we can avoid what's coming." The eldest Carson brother spat on the ground. "You're outnumbered 5-1, old-timer. Your reputation won't save you or this town." "Numbers," Jed replied softly, though everyone heard him, "don't mean much to a dead man." His hand rested casually near his holster. "And I've got nothing left to prove to anyone." The tension stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. In the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the hour. High noon had arrived in Millbrook, and with it, the moment of truth. Everything happened in the span of a heartbeat. The eldest Carson brother's hand twitched toward his gun. A fatal mistake. Jed's draw was a blur of motion, so fast it seemed impossible for a man his age. The Colt's report cracked like thunder, and Carson pitched backward from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. The street erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from every window and doorway as the townspeople opened up on the gang. Horses reared and screamed, throwing riders to the ground. Wade dove for cover behind a water trough, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Jed's movements were precise, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. 2 more riders fell before they could even clear their holsters. Bill Hawkins' cavalry carbine barked from the roof of the general store, picking off outlaws with military precision. "Kill him!" Wade screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Kill the old man!" A group of riders charged the saloon, guns blazing. Bullets splintered wood around Jed, but he didn't flinch. His return fire was methodical, deadly. Each pull of the trigger meant another outlaw down. He moved like a man half his age, decades of experience evident in every action. The second Carson brother managed to get off a shot that grazed Jed's shoulder, drawing blood. The outlaw's victory was short-lived. Jed's response took him through the throat. The third brother, seeing his siblings fall, turned his horse to flee, but caught a bullet from Tom Bennett's revolver. Inside the saloon, Sarah and several townswomen reloaded weapons with remarkable efficiency, keeping the defenders supplied with ammunition. The fear in their eyes had been replaced by grim determination. Wade, realizing his advantage in numbers was rapidly disappearing, emerged from cover with a stick of dynamite. "Burn it down," he shouted to his remaining men. "Burn the whole damn town!" Before he could light the fuse, Jed's bullet struck his hand, sending the dynamite tumbling harmlessly into the dust. Wade screamed in pain and rage, firing wildly with his remaining hand. His shots went wide, but they forced Jed to duck behind the balcony railing. The surviving gang members, seeing their leaders fallen and their attack failing, began to retreat. Those who could still ride grabbed their horses, others ran on foot, desperate to escape the killing ground the street had become. Wade, clutching his bleeding hand, staggered toward his fallen horse. "This isn't over!" he screamed up at Jed. "You hear me, old man? This will never be!" The rest of his threat was cut short by Jed's final shot. Wade collapsed face first into the dust, his threat dying with him. The remaining outlaws fled in panic, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the whimpers of injured men and the nervous shuffling of horses. The battle had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. As the dust settled over Millbrook's main street, townspeople began emerging from their positions, expressing a mix of disbelief and pride. The morning sun revealed the full extent of the battle. More than 20 outlaws lay dead or wounded, while the town's defenders had suffered only minor injuries. Tom Bennett organized a group to round up the wounded gang members, while others began clearing the street. The sight of their quiet town turned battlefield was sobering, but there was also a newfound strength in the way people worked together, shouldering the burden as one. "Never seen anything like it," Bill Hawkins said, approaching Jed with admiration in his voice. "You've still got it, old friend. Every bit as fast as you were in Tombstone." Jed winced slightly as Sarah cleaned and bandaged his shoulder wound. The graze was minor, but it served as a reminder of how close the battle had been. "Wasn't just me," he replied, watching the townspeople work. "Every person here chose to stand their ground. That's what made the difference." The blacksmith approached, carrying Wade's gun belt. "Found this in the street. Reckon it might be worth something to a collector. The gun of the man who challenged the Widowmaker." Jed shook his head. "Bury it with him. Let the legend die there." As the morning wore on, riders from neighboring towns began arriving, drawn by news of the gunfight. Each brought stories of their own troubles with the Carson gang, and each expressed amazement at what the people of Millbrook had accomplished. Mayor Harrison, who had stayed to fight despite his earlier doubts, addressed the gathered crowd. "What happened here today wasn't just about defending our town. It was about standing up to evil, about refusing to let fear rule our lives." He turned to Jed. "We owe you more than we can ever repay." But Jed raised his hand, cutting off the mayor's praise. "You owe me nothing. Every person here fought their own battle today. I just showed them how." Sarah, who hadn't left Jed's side since the fighting ended, spoke up. "What happens now? There might be others like Wade, other gangs who hear about this." "Let them come," the blacksmith's voice boomed. "Millbrook isn't helpless anymore. We know what we're capable of now." Bill Hawkins nodded in agreement. "Word will spread, not just about the Widowmaker, but about a town that fought back. That kind of story carries weight in these parts." Jed looked out over the town, at the people helping each other, at the children peeking out from behind their parents. at the pride in every face. He'd spent years trying to escape his past, but perhaps this was why he'd been guided to Millbrook. Not to hide, but to teach others to stand tall. "The town's changed," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. 2 weeks after the battle, Millbrook had largely returned to normal, though normal had taken on a new meaning. The bullet holes in the saloon's walls remained, now proud badges of honor rather than marks of violence. The townspeople walked taller, carried themselves with quiet confidence that hadn't existed before. Jed stood behind his bar, polishing glasses just as he had the day Wade's gang first arrived. But now, when travelers stopped in, they noticed something different about the place. Maybe it was the way the locals treated the old saloonkeeper, with a respect that went beyond mere friendliness. Or maybe it was the carefully maintained Colt revolver displayed on the wall behind the bar, a reminder of the day the widowmaker came out of retirement. "Got another one asking about you," Sarah said, approaching with an empty tray. "Young guy from up north. Says he's writing a book about famous gunfighters." Jed smiled slightly, shaking his head. "Tell him the same thing you told the others. The widowmaker is just a story. Millbrook's got plenty of other tales worth telling." The saloon's door swung open, and a young boy of about 12 entered, carrying a wooden practice pistol his father had made him. He approached the bar nervously, gathering his courage before speaking. "Mr. Peterson, sir, Pa says you might be willing to teach me. Not about gunfighting," he added quickly, seeing Jed's expression, "but about standing up for what's right, about being brave when things get hard." Jed studied the boy for a long moment, seeing in his eager face the same determination he'd seen in the townspeople during the battle. Finally, he nodded. "Come by tomorrow morning. We'll start with the most important lesson." "What's that, sir?" "That the fastest draw isn't what makes a man dangerous. It's knowing when not to draw at all." As the boy left, practically floating with excitement, Bill Hawkins entered. The old cavalryman had decided to stay in Millbrook, claiming the town had grown on him. "Heard Wade's brother is asking around about what happened here," Bill said quietly. "Might be looking for revenge." Jed continued polishing his glass, but a faint smile crossed his face. "Let him ask. He'll learn what others are learning. That it wasn't just one old gunfighter who defended this town. It was all of us." The afternoon sun slanted through the saloon's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, life in Millbrook continued. Children playing, horses clopping down the street, shopkeepers calling out to customers. But now there was something else in the air, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just peace. It was peace that had been earned, paid for, with courage and determination. And watching over it all, from behind his bar in the Last Stop Saloon, was a legend who had finally found his true purpose, not as a dealer of death, but as a teacher of life. If you enjoyed this story of redemption, bravery, and classic Western justice, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a good Western tale. And let us know in the comments, what was your favorite moment? We love hearing from you.